9 months after the mysterious disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, another tragedy struck. A plane headed to Singapore also suddenly disappeared. Just as everyone feared another incident like Malaysia Airlines 370, the wreckage was found in the sea. All 100+ people on board lost their lives. Then, the contents of the cockpit recording shocked the investigators. This is the story we're sharing today. The crash of AirAsia Flight 8501. On the morning of December 28, 2014, at 5:35 a.m., an Airbus A320 aircraft had just taken off from Juanda International Airport in Indonesia. Its destination was Singapore's Changi Airport. The route would pass over the Java Sea. The entire flight was expected to take about 2 hours. The plane involved in this disaster was AirAsia Flight 8501, an aircraft under the AirAsia brand. At the time, it carried 155 passengers and 7 crew members, a total of 160 people. The captain, Irianto, was Indonesian and 53 years old. As of the end of 2014, he had logged over 20,000 flight hours in his career. He was a seasoned pilot and one of AirAsia's most experienced. The first officer was Remy Emmanuel Plessel. The first officer, Remy Emmanuel Plessel, was French and 46 years old. He had approximately 2,000 hours of flight experience. For this flight, he was in charge of the controls. The captain was primarily responsible for monitoring the instruments and handling radio communications. The plane reached the skies over the Java Sea. At this point, the weather outside began to deteriorate. A storm system was forming. To prevent icing on the wings, the captain activated the anti-icing system. At the same time, to avoid a thunderstorm ahead, the captain requested permission from air traffic control to climb to a higher altitude. However, Jakarta Air Traffic Control, citing congestion. 2 minutes later, when air traffic control contacted them to approve the climb, there was no response from Flight 8501. 3 more minutes passed, and the plane suddenly disappeared from radar. The last known location was near Indonesia's Karamata Strait. Chaos broke out in the Air Traffic Control Center. This was especially alarming because, just 9 months earlier, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had also vanished. That plane remains missing to this day. To quickly locate the missing Flight 8501, the Indonesian government sought assistance from China, Singapore, Malaysia, the United States, and Australia. Soon after, helicopters and warships from multiple countries gathered. They began searching the Java Sea. It wasn't until 2 days later that an Indonesian warship spotted the wreckage near Kalimantan Island. There were life jackets, luggage, and even human remains. It was confirmed to be the missing AirAsia Flight 8501. Ultimately, only 48 bodies were recovered. The other 114 remain missing to this day. The black box was successfully recovered 2 weeks later. By then, everyone wanted to know what exactly happened on the plane. After their last communication with air traffic control, could it have been another mysterious crash? Or was it shot down? Conspiracy theories quickly spread online and in the media. This placed immense pressure on Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee. While analyzing data from the black box, they also invited French investigators for assistance. However, radar data, wreckage analysis, and recordings of conversations with air traffic control provided few clues. It wasn't until the cockpit voice recording was examined that the investigation made a breakthrough. With further analysis, a shocking truth began to emerge. Before the captain requested to climb to a higher altitude, a fault warning had already sounded inside the cockpit. It indicated a malfunction in the rudder travel limiter within the aircraft's autopilot system. This system controls the deflection angle of the rudder, which adjusts to changing flight conditions. Its primary purpose is simple: to limit excessive rudder deflections and prevent structural stress. This issue would later prove critical to the investigation. To prevent excessive rudder deflections at certain speeds, such deflections could damage the rudder's structure. This malfunction wasn't considered a major issue, as long as they followed the procedures provided by the electronic central monitoring system. The captain had already resolved it this way twice before. He then requested clearance to climb to a higher altitude. However, air traffic control delayed their approval by 2 minutes due to congestion. During those 2 minutes, the fault warning reappeared. Both pilots became frustrated. Why wouldn't it just stop? So when air traffic control contacted them again to approve the climb, both pilots were busy checking the warning messages. They didn't respond to the call. The repeated fault warnings annoyed them greatly. They decided not to follow the system's recommended procedure to resolve it. Instead, they wanted to find a permanent solution. The captain had a sudden idea. He thought, why not turn off the limiter switch entirely? He then left his seat to access the circuit breaker panel behind the first officer. This idea wasn't something the captain came up with randomly. He had actually learned it from ground engineers before the flight took off. This fault had already occurred multiple times. The captain had called for maintenance to fix it. The engineer's solution was quite simple. They just restarted the system. However, the warning kept coming back even after the restart. So, the engineer simply pulled the circuit breaker for the main computer. The captain asked, "Is this okay?" The engineer replied, "Yes. This way, the fault won't show up anymore. So if it happens again, I can just do this," asked the captain. The engineer said, "Just follow the central monitoring system's instructions." The conversation was vague and unclear, with both parties missing critical details. They lacked an understanding of the key issue. Pulling the circuit breaker might clear the warning, but this action was only safe when the aircraft was on the ground. If done mid-flight, it could lead to serious problems. This was because the circuit breaker was also connected to the flight stabilization system. When the circuit breaker was pulled, the autopilot system, auto thrust, and auto throttle systems all became inoperable. As a result, the moment the circuit breaker was pulled, the rudder deflected 3 degrees to the left. This caused the aircraft to begin tilting to the left. Over the next 9 seconds, neither pilot noticed the issue. When the captain returned to his seat to check the instruments, he realized that the bank angle of the plane had reached 54 degrees. Shocked, the captain shouted, "Oh my God," and immediately instructed the first officer to level the plane. The first officer quickly pushed the control stick to the right. In just 2 seconds, he managed to level the plane. However, the rapid correction to the right disturbed the first officer's sense of balance. After the plane stabilized horizontally, he still felt as though it was turning to the right. In response, he forcefully pushed the control stick to the left. The plane then began tilting to the left again. The captain shouted once more, "Level the plane. Level it." Amid the back-and-forth movements, the first officer became completely disoriented. He suddenly felt as though the plane was descending. In panic, he pulled the control stick forcefully backward. As a result, the plane's nose sharply rose, and it began to stall. It was similar to how a driver might overreact and steer erratically in an emergency situation. Fortunately, the plane had dual control systems. The correct action at that moment would have been for the captain to take over and control the aircraft. After all, he was still composed at the time. However, the captain didn't take control. Instead, he just repeatedly shouted at the first officer, "Pull down." In Chinese, it translates to lower it, pull it down. The captain noticed the plane's pitch angle was increasing, but the captain's old habit returned. He wasn't clear in his instructions. Pull what down? He didn't specify. As a result, the first officer assumed he meant to continue pulling the control stick backward. However, what the captain actually meant was to push the nose of the plane down. He failed to communicate this clearly. Seeing the pitch angle grow even steeper, the captain realized that if he didn't act, it would be too late. The plane was on the verge of stalling. He decisively pressed a button on his control stick. Holding it down for a few seconds would disable the first officer's controls, but the captain only double-tapped the button, thinking it had disengaged the first officer's controls. The first officer, inexperienced and spatially disoriented, wasn't able to respond effectively. However, as a seasoned pilot with over 20,000 flight hours, the captain should have known better. When taking control of the aircraft, he failed to inform the first officer by saying, "I have control." He simply assumed the first officer understood. He thought he was now solely in control of the plane. In reality, during this period, both of them were controlling the aircraft simultaneously. Since the captain didn't say anything, the first officer had no idea the captain was taking over. As a result, one tried to lift the plane's nose, while the other desperately tried to push the nose down. As a result, their efforts canceled each other out. The plane continued climbing. When the pitch angle reached 45 degrees, the plane stalled completely. In their struggle to regain control, a multi-million-dollar aircraft with 162 people on board plummeted into the Java Sea almost in free fall. The immediate cause of the crash was clear. But one question remained. Why did the rudder travel limiter keep malfunctioning? Subsequent inspections revealed a crack in a solder joint on the circuit board. This caused intermittent failures in the actuator, similar to what we commonly describe as a loose connection. AirAsia's maintenance team, however, failed to properly address the issue. A thorough repair would have been costly, and the plane would have been grounded for some time. This was something AirAsia wasn't willing to accept. The A320 was leased from Germany, and keeping it grounded without generating revenue would have increased costs even further. The maintenance team had no choice but to patch the issue temporarily. The causes of this crash are quite representative. You can't simply blame the airline, the maintenance team, or the pilots. All parties shared some responsibility, though the pilot's actions played the largest role. AirAsia also bears responsibility for inadequate pilot training and ignoring maintenance issues to prioritize profit. Everything seemed fine in normal circumstances, but when an incident occurred, all the problems were exposed. In aviation safety, there's no room for carelessness, because once a tragedy occurs, accountability becomes even more costly, and no amount of compensation can bring back the lives lost. That's the end of this video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.